Hi, this is great. Thanks very much, Michael, to inviting me along this morning. 10 minutes was a very short amount of time to cover biodiversity loss and climate change and the space in which those two issues overlap and interact. So I'm going to fly through a little bit of the impacts of climate change on biodiversity in Ireland, the impacts of our responses to climate change, the nature-based solutions to climate change, and where to from here. It's very important to state, I think, at the outset, a lot of people tend to say, you often hear that, oh, climate change is the worst thing, the worst threat facing our natural ecosystems. It is not. Interestingly, it's still habitat loss. It's all those pressures which our day-to-day activities and our systems and our ways of living are putting on biodiversity, are having that's causing the loss of biodiversity that we're seeing in the extinction crisis. Climate change is another nail in that coffin, but it's not the primary driver of biodiversity loss. One of the things that I always think illustrates quite well the impacts, though, of climate change on biodiversity is we all know that nature is, there's a synchronicity, there's a timing, there's food webs and ecosystems that have developed over thousands or even tens of thousands of years. And things are closely tuned into each other, the way that they work. And one thing that we have here in Ireland are blue tits. They feed off the caterpillars, which feed off the early oak leaves in springtime. And when we have an earlier spring, when spring comes in 2 weeks earlier, and those oak leaves are a little bit more mature come April, they have higher levels of tannin in their leaves. So the caterpillars that feed off those oak leaves then, they become hard for the baby blue tits to digest. So you get a higher mortality rate in the broods of blue tits that are feeding off the caterpillars on the more mature oak leaves. Throughout all of our ecosystems and our habitats, there are very finely tuned timings and interactions, and climate change by little shifts in temperature or timing really throw things off balance and out of kilter. So there can be massive impacts that we don't realise often until they've really kicked in. Here's another one with Greenland white-fronted geese. Their timing when they go to Greenland and when they come back to Ireland is carefully timed to coincide with the spring in Greenland and when the buds of a certain plant that they depend on come up. And with spring being later, when they arrive after a long flight, they're finding that those buds often aren't there. So again, higher mortality. Kittiwakes, razorbills, Arctic terns, these seabirds that we love, that we have so many of all around the Irish coast. A lot of those depend on sand eels. And when sand eels are moving further northwards and westwards, the foraging distances from these to their nest sites to feed their young to get to the sand eels becomes not feasible anymore. So they can't access their food source. So again, higher mortality of their broods. Sundew. I don't know how many people here know of the sundew. It's this tiny little insectivorous plant that lives at our peat bogs. We have 3 different species of sundew in Ireland, and those little sticky tentacles, they help it trap flies and midges. This is a plant that eats animals, living all over Irish bogs, which is quite a wonderful thing, but it depends on the wet and acidic conditions in Irish bogs. So when we dry out those bogs, whether it's through draining them off for turf cutting or because we're getting longer droughts in April and May, plants like sundew are not faring well. But again, this emphasises that the loss of peat bogs is primarily because of our activities. It's habitat loss. Climate change, again, when we're getting longer droughts, is just another factor. These are little ocean organisms, zooplankton, tiny little things that float around in our oceans and are at the base of the food chain in our marine ecosystems. These depend on a lot of calcium. They need calcium to make their little skeletons. Often their skeletons are inside their bodies. But here's a cartoon that illustrates the acidic, the increasing acidity of our oceans because of more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the the little guys that we just saw, the zooplankton, and a whole host of other marine organisms are really suffering because of the the increasing acidification in our oceans. So to reduce the pressure on species and habitats, we need to tackle climate change. We need to do all those things that everybody here, I'm sure, is very familiar with. Reducing emissions from fossil fuels and from land use change. But equally important is stopping further habitat loss. So all those other things that we do to protect SACs and SPAs, the Birds and Habitats Directives, NHAs, all of our protected areas, our local protected areas as well. We need to be better at preventing harm to those habitat types, because a healthier habitat, a healthier ecosystem is more resilient to those impacts. We need to strengthen the protection for biodiversity in designated areas and in the wider countryside as well, not just in designated areas, and restore our ecosystems to good health. And the good news here is often these two activities are not in conflict. So restoring ecosystem health and biodiversity is often beneficial also to climate mitigation and adaptation. And one of these areas where there's a lot of crossover is nature-based solutions to climate change. And there are benefits to climate action from nature conservation. So we'll go with the peat bogs again, which are a particularly good example. Peatlands are the most space-effective carbon stores of all terrestrial ecosystems. Our peat bogs here in Ireland store vast amounts of carbon dioxide, 1,566 million tonnes of carbon. And a healthy peat bog, a blanket bog, will sequester about 60,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide annually, and a deeper peat bog, like the Midlands, the Lowlands bog, the raised bogs, will sequester about 140,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide annually. So if this was working right, this is a huge ally to us in fighting climate change, is having healthy peat bogs. But unfortunately, the current situation is that our peat bogs are a net source of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere because they are drained, because the water table is reduced. They're releasing more carbon dioxide than they are absorbing. So this is one example where we could be working with nature, but we are not. We're doing the opposite, and our peat bogs are contributing more to the problem. The way to solve this is to re-wet the peat bogs. There's also huge benefits of having healthy peat bogs to our water resources. They store a lot of rain as it comes down, and this is re-released more slowly into the catchment. And it helps to improve water quality as well, which is important for our drinking water. There's a nice stream coming off a peat bog. And bogs are, of course, really, really wonderful for biodiversity. There's another version of the sundew in the top corner there, with a few midges stuck onto its tentacles. Then we have a meadow pipit. We have some sphagnum mosses. They're the bog builders. They're the ones that soak up all the water and soak up all the carbon dioxide. We have snipe down there. And peat bog restoration is an activity that will benefit water quality, that will benefit biodiversity, and will reduce climate emissions and help them to soak up carbon dioxide, become active sinks as well. Now, flooding is another issue. We have had enormous problems with flooding all over the country in recent years, as all of you, I'm sure, will know. And there are lots of different factors throughout the landscape which impact flooding. Developments in floodplains, so when we put in more apartments or supermarkets or whatever it is into our floodplains, the ground permeability, when we have a lot of urban paving, agricultural land management, when we have harder soils that don't soak up the water as readily. Straightening of river channels also helps to speed up the flow, which increases flooding. Tree cover and the roughness of vegetation cover. When you've got rough vegetation in a scrubland or a woodland or a healthy peat bog, it means that the water doesn't run off the catchment areas into the river quite so well, and the presence of wetlands. So natural flood management is an approach where you work with nature, you work with the processes of nature to slow down the flow of water throughout the catchment into river channels and reduce flooding. things like woodland planting, conservation and creation of wetlands, agricultural land management, floodplain rehabilitation, opening up land to flooding. That's where you strategically give a landowner an incentive to allow their land to flood when there is a flood warning in effect. Bunds and dams in the upper catchment. Now there are some reports on this, one that I wrote for Friends of the Earth and one by the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency looking at natural flood management. This is just the peat bogs and the natural flood management are just two examples of where there's a lot we can do to manage elements of our landscape to help mitigate against climate change and to help us in adapting to the impacts of climate change. And these approaches 99% of the time, not always, benefit both biodiversity and climate mitigation. And also we need to get back to the basics, which is respecting the Birds Directive, the Habitats Directive, all of our SACs and our SPAs throughout the country where the implementation has been so weak and so problematic. And we all, I'm sure, are familiar with things like appropriate assessments and the difficult, challenging elements of implementing the Habitats Directive in Ireland. These are things that as climate change gets more severe, we need to get better and better at implementing our environmental laws. These are some of our protected areas there. We have a whole diverse range of habitats across Ireland that are protected. I know that I'm out of time now. There is a lot of hope if we can grasp the good elements, the options that we have. There is a lot more community action for nature conservation. As I go up and down the country with EcoEye and other projects, I am amazed to see communities initiating real ground-up action for nature conservation and climate mitigation. And that always gives me a huge amount of hope, and that's something as councillors and local authorities, you are in the ideal position to facilitate and support community action. There is a lot more information now, like with citizen science and with better collection of data on conservation trends. There's mounting pressure on government to act. So if any of you have any interest in this, which you do because you're here today, we need to seize on this pressure. We also need to strengthen policy at local authority level, and I know that that's something that leads us nicely to the next two speakers who are going to be talking about local biodiversity action plans at the county council level, and we're going to be discussing more about local policy implementation in the workshop that we're going to have at 12 o'clock.